So good afternoon, everyone. Today it's my big pleasure to have here Simone Schleper. She is an assistant professor for the Global History of Science, Technology, and the Environment at Maastricht University. Her book, Planning for the Planet on the CIUHCT, was published in 2019 with Bergman Books. The talk is based on her 2022 article, Caribou Crossings, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System and Stakeholdership in the Anthropocene, which won the ASHE 2023 Alice Hamilton Article Prize, and which is the title of her talk today here. Simone, for us, it's a huge pleasure to have you today here. Thank you so much for accepting your invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. PowerPoint. So hopefully this is visible. Great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so as Monique already said, this is part of research I did actually during the COVID period. So I'm really glad that it actually worked out so well, and that I got to write this really nice article. So in this, this is part of a bigger project that I was part of in 2019, which was called Moving Animals. That was run here by Raftebond and Maastricht University. And for my part in the project, I looked at the history of researching, managing, and representing migratory species in the 20th century in particular. And for this article, I was, as part of the project, I was particularly interested in types of indicators used to research the impact of industrial infrastructures on migratory mammals, and the type of what we call agency assigned to these migratory animals. So I'm skipping a bit too fast. Okay, so historians of science have historians of ecology and nature conservation have long looked at the ways in which wildlife management has been based on traditional ontologies about wildlife habitats, often idealized as pristine places that are undisturbed by human influences, and very much based on a very traditional sense of the separation between wild nature on the one side and human culture on the other. Preservationist ideas have, however, not been based on sentiments alone, right? Authors have shown that scientific arguments too have been mobilized to argue for forms of what has often been called fortress conservation. So for instance, time and again, the large range of seasonally migrating ungulates, such as wildebeest, antelopes, or gazelles, have been used to exclude humans from large parts of the African savanna, for instance, as we see here in the Serengeti National Park. You know, in reality, however, this is hardly practicable, and there are very few places that are actually that vast, and you know, whether you can really have these kind of conservation fortresses, of course, they're politically undesirable, but whether you can also really put this in practice is, in a lot of places, is quite questionable. Yet only recently, historians of science have concerned themselves with more, you could say, utilitarian forms of nature conservation that consciously distance themselves from these preservationist agendas. But in fact, at least from the 1960s onwards, ambitions emerged within international conservation circles to reconcile land and resource development with ecologically sound advice, and in places with a strong human presence. One of the few, historians who have actually looked at this in more detail is Gary Kroll, who has shown how in the post-war period, prominent conservationists like Aldous Stalker-Leopold, were involved in managing human-wildlife interaction in the case of the permeable highway. So we all know these highway crossings, for instance, or ecoducts, they're also often called. So according to Kroll, highway crossings combine animal movement with human infrastructure, and as such present an early example of experiments with wildlife in the Anthropocene that focus on protecting ecological processes rather than entire habitats. Other authors, such as Jamie Lorimer, not an historian but a geographer, who has been concerned with conservation in the Anthropocene specifically, and then in his case from an anthropological perspective, has highlighted how this type of research, so this type of ecological research that focuses on how to make human infrastructure compatible with animal movements, for instance, has often focused on behavior and the needs of animals, and has allowed for a more respectful form of conservation. That's what he says, taking into consideration animal agency. Now, in this talk, I want to engage with this notion of conservation in the Anthropocene from a history of science perspective. And I want to do so by looking at one iconic case of infrastructure development that since the 1970s continues to cause controversies amongst conservationists and wildlife experts working for international organizations, federal and state agencies, and independent consultancy bureaus. Controversies, namely about how to combine infrastructure development and wildlife conservation. And the case I'm talking about is, of course, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS for short. As one of the largest, or one of the first large-scale industrial projects that prior to its construction required involved parties to produce an environmental impact statement, according to the US National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. The TAP's significance was widely recognized within the national and the international conservation community. And in fact, the finding from the assessment, this impact assessment of the TAPS, became part of the Environmental Policy Act's Council on Environmental Quality Guidelines. So the TAPS there was also a case study for these environmental assessment procedures, especially in the US context. In my work, I looked at how the TAPS became an experimental device for wildlife researchers concerned with the pipeline's impact to experiment with the range of migratory caribous and the annual movements. And you can really see that the pipeline becomes this kind of hybrid space between not only the field and the laboratory, if you will, but also between some wild ranges of animals and human-made infrastructure. Now, from the beginning, caribous were a central concern in controversies concerning the pipeline and its impact, with 3 caribou herds migrating through the Prudhoe Bay area, and another one crossing this pipeline. And you can see this here on the map. So you see on the right side, you see the pipeline running from the drilling site in Prudhoe Bay in the north, south to the ice report in Valdez, from where the crude oil could be shipped. And you had 3 caribou herds in this area, the Western Arctic herd, the Central Arctic herd, and the porcupine herd. Especially the Central Arctic herd was thought to be affected by oil development in this area. Interesting is also that the pipeline was to run through, so it was cutting through two areas of protected land, the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve that you can see here on the eastern side, and a National Petroleum Reserve on the other side, so land that hadn't been developed for a very long time, that had been protected for some time, and that had been the home for these caribous for quite some time. So as soon as there are plans to construct this pipeline, caribous became a central concern in a controversy that emerged on whether to build this pipeline or not, and whether these caribou herds were actually negatively affected by this. By the 1960s, it was known that the animals, so the caribous, animals' migration followed a counterclockwise movement from spring calving grounds to summer and finally winter foraging grounds. Caribous were, of course, highly mobile, also between periods of migration. And especially threatened were the central Arctic herd, as I mentioned, and it was feared that the pipeline would divide their summer range basically down the middle and interfere with their movements. So from the moment that oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay in 1968, this became a concern. Environmentalist and also indigenous protests and legal challenges to the project actually managed to stop all building and drilling in the Prudhoe Bay area for a period of about 4 years. Yet, when in late 1973, the legal challenges to the pipeline were overruled by Richard Nixon's Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, the oppositional discourse coalition was, on the one hand, defeated. On the other hand, it had already resulted in demands for thorough environmental impact procedures that required the oil companies involved in the taps to investigate potential mitigation measures that would allow the caribous to strive despite the building of the pipeline. So it was a little success for them there. Now, from the 1970s onwards, wildlife research into the impact of the pipeline and into this Arctic ecosystem and the movement of caribous and other animals, but caribous in particular, elicited discussion at various levels of biological research, ranging from ecology to behavioral research, not just in Alaska, but also elsewhere. In my research, I looked at the work by professional wildlife experts at consultancies, various wildlife agencies, and at the University of Alaska, who were assigned the task to negotiate the construction of this linear pipeline infrastructure with the animals movement. Drawing on new research in behavioral biology, one group of wildlife experts promoted ecologically sound development by promoting the ability of caribous to learn how to navigate underpasses and various sections of the pipeline. So here we really see one group putting a lot of emphasis on caribous' ability to get adapted to new environments, to be able to navigate changed environments. This group also put a lot of emphasis on ecological processes, so very similar to what Jamie Lorimer argues in the beginning, or what I've mentioned in the beginning, these arguments that we need to look at animal behavior and work with that behavior. Yet the second group mobilized arguments from the field of trophic ecology, so more sort of quantitative studies into the nutritional needs of caribous, the calorie intakes, and how many calories they would burn. And the second group actually pointed to potential long-term disturbances in the nutritional cycle in these environments that could really harm caribous, and use this to argue against the pipeline. So what I want to show in this talk then, or what I want to discuss in this talk then, is how arguments that seem to be seemingly related closer to habitat protection, namely those that are based on intact ecosystems and intact nutritious cycles, so more conservative arguments for conservation, if you want to take, in this case, were actually used in a way to protect environmental stakes, not just those of the caribous, but also of other animals and other entities in this environment. The problem, namely, was that the behavioral research by the first group that I just mentioned, the one that focused on caribou's learning ability and their ability to adapt, although highlighting what we might call animals' agency, and this way being maybe more in line with recent calls for behavior-based conservation in the Anthropocene, these kind of arguments actually allowed the oil industry to argue for additional extraction projects, as it seemed to suggest that animals could simply get used to more changes in their environment. Arguments based on the material independencies of animals on their environment, on the other hand, so these more conservative arguments, if you will, emerged actually as an attempt to discredit this kind of behavioral research that could be easily hijacked by the oil industry. And although these arguments were seemingly similar to traditional arguments on range preservation, the second type of research into what the researchers called cumulative impact of the pipeline actually allowed for a wider range of ecological stakes and interests, including those of caribous, other animals, and people, as I will show. So while concerns about caribous played an important role in the initial protests against the pipeline, not all wildlife experts actually opposed the project. A number of ecologists actually welcomed the taps as an opportunity to invest in and experiment with ecologically sound conservation and development. So that's quite interesting, actually. The members of the international conservation, members of international conservation organizations, especially such as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, CIUHCT, hoped that the construction of the pipeline would result in additional funding for ecological research and the inclusion of conservation advice in large-scale industrial construction project. And they already here had this idea in mind that probably environmental impact assessment would become part of all industrial development projects, and that organizations such as IUCN could actually play a big role in these assessment procedures. For this particular project, IUCN members pointed out that in the past, environmental research in Alaska had often focused on the modification of traditional caribou ranges for resource development in this territory, and that there was actually a tradition of working with modified land. First of these experiments or with caribou ranges can be traced to early biological projects in the North American Arctic that date back to the interwar period. Then you had the Canadian Reindeer Project, in which in the 1920s, the Canadian government actually imported Scandinavian reindeer, which is technically the same species, but then in Europe has a long history of being tamed and of living together with humans. And the Canadian government wanted to import these reindeers that were used to living and working with humans to stimulate the fur and the meat trade in the northern provinces. This was, of course, also this was, you know, a translocation experiment, but at the same time also colonial exercise, aiming at integrating native herders into the resource economy. And this continued into the 1960s. In the United States too, early Arctic ungulate research was connected to plans that aimed at opening up Arctic territories for economic activities. Already, in the early 1950s, two well-known naturalists, Frank Fraser Darling and Aldo Starker-Leopold, whom I've already mentioned in the beginning, visited the far west of the Alaskan Arctic to investigate the impact of increased land use on Arctic mammals. Darling's and Leopold's study was governmentally funded, and it put a lot of emphasis on the adaptability of Arctic ungulates. In their report, the two authors proposed the use and the development of the Arctic and natural resources there as long as the development respected ecological processes and the behavior of the ungulates. So according to them, strict wildlife preservation and the preservation of entire ranges, so conservative conservation, if you will, was actually an unrealistic endeavor. It was absolutely fine to develop this land and also caribous as a resource, as long as this development allowed large mammals to thrive. So this opportunity to manage and to produce game was not to be neglected. Similar, what we could call utilitarian ideas were shared in the international conservation circles to which Leopold and Darling belonged. And these circles offered their assistance when oil companies involved in the plans for the taps reached out in the late 1960s. So in the late 1960s, Alaskan oil developers actually sought contact with conservation organizations such as IUCN and their members, and invited several wildlife personae such as Peter Scott from the World Wildlife Fund and Max Nicholson from IUCN and the International Biological Program to visit the pipeline construction site. Both Scott and Nicholson were determined conservationists with a very strong interest in the natural world. Yet here they were really open to investigate shared ground with the extractivist industry. In 1970 and 71, the controversy concerning the construction of the pipeline led to several visits by Nicholson and Scott, arranged by British Petroleum, BP. Scott's and Nicholson's response to the TAPS controversy differed actually very radically from more activist voices that were opposing the pipeline. And here, quote, "People need oil and now it must flow from the Arctic." That's something that Scott wrote in an essay in the Applied Conservation Journal Oryx in 1970. In 1971, Nicholson, Darling, and Scott drafted a joint statement for the IUCN, WWF, and the International Biological Program, commenting on the construction plans for the Alaska pipeline. And basically what they said is that the oil will have to come out somehow from Alaska. And in view of people's need for oil, it should be made available for use as long as these companies reasonably satisfied the environmental requests that were made to them. And in their views, Alaska, the pipeline service company that was in charge of the TAPS at the time, was actually fulfilling these environmental requests because they planned to build underpasses and overpasses for migratory ungulates such as the caribous. Interesting here is that this joint statement portrayed Alaska as an important habitat for North American wilderness and also emphasized IUCN's scientific research interests in Alaskan flora and fauna. But nevertheless, Alaska was seen as spacious enough to combine the protection of ecological processes with this development of oil. So then researchers, for instance, at the University of Alaska started to investigate how these mitigation requests could actually be put in practice as a consequence of the plans to build the pipeline and as a consequence of the approval by the international conservation community. So as early as spring 1971, wildlife ecologists at the University of Alaska had started experiments with pipelines and animal movement in the construction site. Kenneth Klein, a doctoral student supervised by the wildlife biologist Kenneth Child, a doctoral student supervised by the wildlife biologist David Klein, conducted first experiments with simulated pipelines to understand how migratory and nomadic mammals would actually be affected by this pipeline infrastructure. And you can see this here on the slides. You have the material that they experimented with. So they put oil barrels on stilts, basically, and tried to understand whether migratory caribous or other migratory species would actually work under these oil barrels. And on the other side, you see how they used snow fences to simulate a pipeline that would run over the ground, closer to the ground, and build ramps to see whether these would be used by animals. So these experiments seemed not to be very successful at first, as overall the crossing rates registered by the two researchers, so the percentage of observed caribous that actually crossed the structure at least once, remained pretty low. There was some evidence, however, that over time, the animals seemed to get used to the pipeline or the simulated pipeline. This early research by Child and Klein was welcomed by a larger group of conservationists who were increasingly interested in the behavior of large moving animals and their ability to adapt to modified terrains or modifications in their terrain. In 1971, for instance, Klein and Child were invited by IUCN to present at a conference that was held in Alberta, Canada, on the behavior of ungulates. And at this conference, conservationists and wildlife professionals met researchers in behavioral ecology who shared their interest in this behavior in modified terrains. This is also the time when behavioral research in general experienced a push with dominant research schools in Oxford, England, for instance, also in Germany. But much of the fundamental behavioral research as pioneered in these centers in England and in Germany was conducted in these very strictly protected African national parks without human presence. Here the TAPs seem to allow something new, right? It seemed to allow experimenting or observing animals living in a terrain that was already modified and that was close to industrial structures. So at the conference, a vivid exchange took place between ungulate researchers, conservationists, but also game wardens who had worked in national parks in North America, but also in Africa and Scandinavia, and who reported on this intersection of behavioral research and also the management of spatial areas and the migration of ungulates. Again, particular interest of participants in this conference was the ability of caribous to learn and adapt, a central topic at the conference at large. And during the discussions of Charles and Klein's work in particular was the behavioral concept of habituation, the idea that over time animals would start to ignore changes made in their environment. The concept had its origin in behavioral field research that required the immersion of research into their field site. And you can think, for instance, of the work by Jane Goodall that was also conducted at the time, right, where Goodall had really had to immerse into the environment, had to spend quite a lot of time with her chimps to be sort of accepted by the animals. So the animals would get used to her being there. They would become habituated to Goodall being in that ecosystem and would start to ignore her. And that was used to argue that even though there was a human observing there, you would still do original observation. So their habituation became really important. And this concept now was transferred to animals in terrains that were not just modified by human presence, but by industrial infrastructure. So most participants at the conference agreed that it was important to take advantage of the learning ability of ungulates for the sake of conservation, for management, and also for research purposes. And the experiments by Child and Klein were used to, and also future experiments that were hoped to be conducted in the TAPS area were supposed to prove that you can actually have animals getting used to changes in the terrain, which would also make national park management in areas that were also, for instance, used for skiing or for hiking a lot more credible and easier. It was particularly interesting in the North American context. So the subsequent research that was conducted, for instance, by the Alaska Department of Fishing and Game into crossing successes of the different caribou herds was in fact heavily influenced by this idea of habituation. By 1976, at least some habituation was recognized. This is after the pipeline then had actually been built. Some habituation was recognized, at least for bulls, caribou bulls. And in the following years, the habituation hypothesis gained additional traction and gained more and more traction. So despite these first negative predictions about the reactions of caribous and to the pipeline by, for instance, Child and Klein, actually the Alaskan Department of Fishing and Game suggested, based on their own observations and error counts, suggested that between 1972 and 83, the Central Arctic herd, so the herd that was closest to the Prudhoe Bay area that I showed you in the beginning, that their population had actually gone up by 13%. So the caribou seemed to be doing pretty well. And those wildlife researchers who pointed to the ability of caribous to adapt and change their behavior to their changed environments seem to be right. Now, research into the effects of the pipeline and adjacent road structures continued into the 1990s with occasional support by the industry. And at this moment, it's important to say that all kinds of biological research in the pipeline area or in that larger area close or adjacent to the pipeline structure has at one point been funded by the oil industry. So it's not just the research into habituation, which seems to be so favorable, or seems to favor this notion of adaptability that has been sponsored by oil companies, but all the research there has been at one point sponsored by all money. So it's very difficult to say that all sponsorship actually influenced results in one way or another. In 1990, the BP, which was now actually running the pipeline, had asked researchers at an independent consultancy firm, LGL, Alaskan Research Associates, who had also worked with the US Bureau of Land Management before and had worked on previous environmental impact assessment. So BP asked LGL for a 5-year survey on the effects of the infrastructure on the calving of caribous in the area. And LGL was then also asked to be part of a caribou steering committee together with the Alaska Department for Fishing and Game to report on the effectiveness of the different types of infrastructure used to mitigate the environmental impact of the taps. So to see whether these over and underpasses actually worked. So reviewing published and unpublished material, researchers at LGL and also at the Alaskan department, also the Alaskan department researchers found actually strong indicators that while calf and cows avoided the pipeline for about 2 weeks after giving birth, they too over time got used to human activities. Caribous regularly entered the pipeline, moved close to the infrastructure, and one researcher actually suggested that they did favor being close to the infrastructure as gravel pads and shady places under the pipeline seemed to provide some relief from flies and mosquitoes during the summer months. Here we can really see how observed individuals in these studies were described in a way, or were described with a degree of intentionality and the ability to decide about their movements and to decide where to move and how to deal with this infrastructure. So they really have the ability to not only to adapt, but also have a bit of agency here, how they move to and close to the pipeline. So this kind of research became really important in the early 2000s as the 30-year evaluation of the TAPS land lease agreement approached. From 2000 onwards, LGL authors refined their findings, conducted, again, observational research at the road close to the oil fields, and close to the pipeline, and they basically stated that there was a clear sign of annual rehabilitation of groups with and also without calves. Published in 2002, the renewed environmental impact statement for the TAPS drew heavily on these reports by LGL, putting the learning of caribou center stage and presenting over and underpasses as successful mitigation measures. And I always like to bring up this quote as one of the biologists working with caribou in the vicinity of one of the pipeline arms in the 1990s told me, quote, "If you want a real understanding of how those animals interact with the oil fields, just go and watch. There's really been no measurable impact to anything," he pointed out when I spoke to him. And he was referring to images like the one that you can see here, which he sent me from his work in the 1990s. And this kind of statement is very typical for behavior researchers who have worked on the pipeline and who have been fascinated by the caribou's ability to learn. This kind of behavioral work resulted in an understanding of caribous as a species that could live in cohabitation with humans. In this understanding, caribous were not considered animals of wilderness, as there was nothing inherently wild in wild animals and nothing inherently cultured in humans. breaking the nature-culture boundary that dominated traditional approaches to wildlife conservation here, behavioral ecologists did not see caribous as determined by their intact ranges, but as agents in changing environments. Essential to the behavioral understanding of caribous and their movement was this notion that caribous could learn to adapt. And their movement, even though stimulated by triggers related to nutrition or weather, was not linked to particular routes or ranges, and it wasn't really predetermined in any way. So while not using the term agency here, you know, I guess that's a term that mostly social science and humanities scholars would use. Behavioral researchers assigned the animals, nevertheless, an active role in the integration of wildlife conservation and human development. And that's very similar to recent calls for conservation in the Anthropocene, as for instance by Jamie Lorimer. As also here, the animals were considered capable of adjusting their behavior and their movement. Okay, so supported by these highly visible indicators, such as crossing rays, or images like these, right? Very visual images of calves and cows close to pipeline structures, very powerful images that seem to suggest that everything was fine, basically. So supported by these highly visible indicators, habituation left, however, little space for definitions of environmental impact other than the pipeline's effect on caribous observed to the pipeline, close to the pipeline, and also other than their absolute numbers. At this time, Alyeska and also the other oil companies involved in managing the taps already received criticism for neglecting the social and the cultural implication of the pipeline on local human communities. In fact, in 1974, first plans for different big gas pipeline projects in the Canadian Mackenzie Valley in Canada had been rejected based on the projected effects that the new pipeline would have on the social and cultural life of Native and Indigenous communities there. This was completely out of the picture in the Alaskan case and completely ignored, except for these first Indigenous protests. Native and Indigenous human communities living close to the pipeline haven't really been taken into account in these original environmental impact statements that focus so closely on the caribous alone. In fact, the focus on caribou counts and crossing behavior has made it also more difficult to research the overall and the diverse ecological effects that the taps might actually have, as well as native land claims and interests that might be affected by the pipeline. Don Russell, one ecologist who has researched the impact of the pipeline infrastructure on different organisms within the Arctic ecosystems, recalls the difficulties of arguing against these powerful images of caribou cows and calves close to the pipeline. And he said, quote, "I remember one of the industry biologist consultants saying, so what if feeding declines by 5%? Show me the bodies. In other words, that these documented effects have an impact at the population level." So that was a challenge.
Simone, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but just to let you know that within a few minutes we reach the 40.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, so
no,
so in order, I have a few more slides, but I think I'll manage. Okay, so in order to meet this challenge, these researchers had to create a radically different type of caribou that focused much more on nutritious cycles. Early after the construction of the taps, an oppositional group of wildlife professionals that emerged who focused on the nutritional ecology of species and the potential interruptions caused by the pipeline system. Now, reducing caribous and its environment to exchanges of calories seems to contradict these recent calls to seek out ways to include animal agency in environmental research and policy. Yet, these almost mechanical conceptualizations that resulted from modeling caribous energetic dependencies here allowed for a broader definition of caribous ecological stakes. So not alone did the energetics approach undergird differentiated concerns about cows and calves, which often, more often than bulls, actually seem to avoid this infrastructure. But they also focus more on the cumulative impact of the pipeline, and in this way, sort of in a roundabout way, allowed for an inclusion of a wider variety of ecological stakeholders, human and non-human. So this bioenergetics approach was radically different. So it didn't rely on direct observation of individuals or groups, but it tried to look at, understand sort of long-term trends in populations. And so the International Biological Program actually did quite a lot of work in this, and focused especially on the scarcity of this environment and the dependency of these caribous on the little vegetation that was there. And basically what this research focused on was this idea that the detour that caribous had to make to find over and underpasses was an unproductive activity that resulted in the unnecessary burning of calories that affected particularly female caribous or cows, if you will, and calves. Cows, especially when feeding or nursing calves, and everyone who has ever nursed a child knows how much energy and how many calories that actually takes. So in the years after, or in the 1980s, the Alaskan Department of Fishing and Game could actually draw on this bioenergetic research that had been produced, for instance, by the International Biological Program. And this is just one last example that I wanted to show. What they started doing is actually working with another kinds of experimental setup with laboratory equipment, or in laboratory settings, partly also outdoors, in which female calves were captured and then hand-reared and then put on these self-built hydraulic treadmills to understand the calorie intake that was needed for them while moving or doing other kinds of activities. In the early 90s, a decline in caribou numbers gave actually new impetus to the nutritional hypothesis. And when in 1999, the National Academy of Science, Engineering and Mathematics composed a committee on the cumulative environmental effects of oil and gas activities on Alaska's northern slope to assess the potential impact of future exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve on caribou herds present. This committee could then actually argue, based on this type of bioenergetics experiments, that any disturbance that induced changes in the nutritious cycle would actually potentially threaten the reproductive success of the herds, and with this was actually putting the future of these caribous at risk. And this emphasis on the cumulative impact of the pipeline is important. So in the notion of cumulative impact had been part of the NEPA's guidelines since 1978. However, by the 1980s, critical voices expressed concerns that aggregated forms of impact, especially those including social and economic, on top of environmental effects had hardly been accounted for in the US development projects. So as I said, in Canada, this had been much more the case. In the US, this was pretty much ignored. So in order to provide evidence against the compelling indicators of countable crossings and these images of cows and calves close to the pipeline, trophic ecologists resorted to more complex calculations of different effects of environmental change on the reproduction rates within the whole caribou population. And while on first sight, these calculations resemble traditional notions of range preservation, this focus on the intact and intricate dependencies actually allowed for an integration, albeit in limited biophysical terms, of various other environmental stakeholders, including animals and plant life, as well as human communities who were also using caribous for sustenance. So this nutritional research provided a suitable basis for interpretations that defined environmental impact as disturbed ecological relationships beyond the scope of caribous alone. And this research then, it was quite important in 2002, when the TAPS land lease agreement was renewed. This committee that I talked about reacted with a very voluminous response, arguing based on these bioenergetic effects against the positive impact statement which had been published before. And up to today, research into this cumulative effect on oil and gas actually plays an important role in countering further development plans that focus on oil development in the Arctic, and that often present the caribous as a case for why development should actually pursue in other places as well, because the caribous get used to it, right? But that's just, of course, focusing on one particular species. This cumulative impact research has been quite successful so far in preventing further oil development projects. But as we all know, whenever the Republican Party is in power, there are new plans to develop gas and oil in the Arctic. So it is sort of a continuous process here. Okay, let me just draw 1 minute for the conclusion. Of course, animal agency has become a very important and often, even though it's often a bit vaguely defined concept in interdisciplinary research concerned with ecology and conservation in the Anthropocene. And the emphasis here has often been on looking at behavior and species adaptability rather than fixed relationships between animals and their environments. After all, it is argued in the past, strict habitat conservation has resulted in forms of fortress conservation and preservationist politics. And without denying forms of animal agency here or the need to rethink preservationist practices, what I wanted to do here is look at the history of science, one history of science example that allows us to critically reflect on the ways in which natural sciences have actually sought to give agency to animals. And in particular, I try to show that the recognition of forms of agency is not necessarily the same as respecting environmental stakeholdership. So in the case at hand, assigning animals more active role did actually not lead to respecting various ecological stakes. At least to some degree, the proposed adaptable nature of wildlife allowed oil companies to celebrate the mitigation efforts successfully. And one could even say maybe that in this interpretation of caribous, the behavioral approach has been, has given maybe too much agency to this caribous in too narrow a form, as the geographer Leah Gibbs has put it in some of her work. So while these ideas about habituation were readily supported by the industry and seem to have led to, additional development plans in protected areas, they also made it very difficult to argue against them. And recognizing this is, I think, very relevant, given, as I said, this continuous push by some of the political parties in the US to open up more terrain for drilling and oil development in areas that house caribou and other animals and humans as well. Okay, so I think I'll leave it at this. I hope I didn't go too much over time. I might have, but it is a story that I just really like.
Thank you.